Well, good morning, everybody. This is Chuck Whitford with JRG Advisors. I'm joined by Francis Horn from our office, and we welcome you to today's webinar, Employee Benefits Alphabet Soup and Good. I want to remind you that in a few days that the PowerPoint presentation will be sent to you along with a webinar replay and the summary of any Q&As. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the appropriate box and press send, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. And we, of course, would like to welcome all of our valued clients and partners, associations that we work with, and I hope you find today's presentation enjoyable. As we head into the middle of summer, we decided to call this webinar Alphabet Soup, really in honor of all the acronyms that we've had to deal with and you've had to deal with over the past 40 or 50 years as we see more and more regulations and requirements on all of us. We're not going to be doing every letter, and we're not going to be doing a deep dive on any one topic. Really, it's more or less for you to see how many things are out there and what is applicable to whom. So, of course, with A, a logical choice for that is the Affordable Care Act. This is the one that's created the biggest attention in the past 6 years. You can see all the reforms that the law has created, such as no pre-existing conditions, rating restrictions, and, of course, the individual and employer mandates, which we are now dealing with. A couple other laws that start with A that we find are important. The Americans with Disability Act, the EUC oversees ADA, and it's had a big impact on the way other things work, such as wellness plans. We'll talk about that, and how it affects employee benefits. But really, again, you notice that the first time you'll see 20 or more employees, we're going to see a continuing theme throughout the presentation to who it applies to. Another big one was the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, or ADEA. Again, you see that 20 or more employees, and it really does have a huge impact. The magic number here is age 40, and like ADEA, it built a foundation for other laws that have come along since. As an example, the Medicare secondary payer rules, which we'll discuss in a moment, comes built from this. And again, the other magic number is 20, as you see here, in terms of 20 employees in your department. Moving on to B, this slide emphasizes really the need for employers to consider their own situation and what laws apply to them prior to just putting in a benefit program. We find that notice requirements are under much more scrutiny than before, and it's important to know what your responsibilities are depending upon what your situation is. As we go to C, the natural choice for C is, of course, COBRA, Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1984, 10 years after ERISA was passed, and of course another major law that has, surprisingly, that's been with us now 32 years. It was created in large part because when we found a lot of spouses were losing coverage when the employee either was terminated or passed away, and this is really the first evidence of cost shifting to employees from the government to employers and employees. Their obligation to provide coverage through the private sector versus depending upon although with the evolution of the insurance exchanges, some employers may feel that COBRA no longer applies, and while we see overall a reduction in COBRA elections because of the law, this is still in effect, and of course wrapped around it are very important notices and deadlines that you still must take pay attention to. There's been no discussion about removing COBRA as part of an employer's obligation, who again has 20 employees or more. I'd like to introduce Frances Horn from our office, and she'll discuss some more of this alphabet soup that we have for you today.
Good morning, and thanks, Chuck. So again, as Chuck said, we continue with C and some other C laws that have been around. And the first one we wanted to address is the Children's Health Insurance Program Reauthorization Act. It's more commonly known as CHIPRA. And CHIPRA is one of our earlier laws. It came around in 2009 because of the American Reorganization Act that President Obama brought into play. And what the basis of CHIPRA is that if an individual or an employee waives coverage under a group health plan, and it finds that they then become eligible, or a dependent of an employee becomes eligible for some type of assistance program, such as a Medicaid program or a CHIP program. CHIP program in Pennsylvania is known as HIP. But they would then be eligible to come on the plan and actually be subsidized by the state government, and then just have the employer pay its contribution. The key things we want to remember about CHIPRA is that it's applicable to all employers, regardless if you're a church plan, a governmental, or a private employer, and regardless of how many employees that you have. So the requirement is that you have to provide health care coverage to an employee, again, as we noted, if they become eligible for premium assistance. One of the quirky things about CHIPRA is that this requirement to provide the coverage, it does exclude high deductible health plans. And another thing that you should be aware of, there is an annual notice required. So every year, and I always recommend during your open enrollment period when you're giving out other annual notices, make sure that you include that CHIPRA notice. And if you don't have one of those, you could probably go ahead and contact JRG if we're your broker, and we'd be glad to provide one of those to you. The next C law that we all know about is called cafeteria plans, also known as Section 125. And why they refer to as Section 125? Because they come under the Internal Revenue Code section. Again, cafeteria plans, this is the ability for an employer to go ahead and collect on a pre-tax basis any type of premium contributions that an employee has to make for any of its benefit programs, such as medical, dental, vision. The key thing is, since it is governed by the Internal Revenue Code, and that means because it's done pre-tax, the government loses money on these types of programs because they're not collecting federal tax on it and some Social Security. So again, the IRS is pretty strict about what has to be done. And the first thing is that it must be in writing. You have to have a plan document. You just can't start collecting pre-tax and think you're okay. Also, elections are irrevocable, except if there is an IRS permitted reason to make a mid-year change. So that's the key thing under cafeteria plans. Going to our next letter of the alphabet, which is D. I've received several questions about domestic partners, so that's why I wanted to include today, or that's why we included this topic today. Generally, insurers will go ahead and permit an employer to offer domestic partner coverage to its employees if it wants to. Again, there is no requirement. This is completely subjective and totally up to the employer. And generally, the employer and also an insurer may put some parameters as to what conditions have to be met for a domestic partner relationship to be formed. Technically, or not technically, but usually the requirements are they have to be over age 18, no blood relationship between the two, some type of joint responsibility. They're either leasing or renting together, and then no marriage relationship with another party. The key thing that I wanted to stress with this issue is a domestic partner is not a spouse. That is where I think the most confusion has come into play. especially because since the Supreme Court, again, overruled the Defense of Marriage Act last year, and we know we have same-sex marriages, people think, well, yeah, a domestic partner is now a spouse. No, that requires an actual marriage for there to be a spouse involved. And the other key thing to remember is that as to a domestic partner, they do not have individual rights under COBRA election. I see a lot of employers now decreasing domestic partner coverage as an offering, only because, since again, everyone can get married now, and it's basically, if we're going to offer coverage for married, then you should be married. So, again, another area. Next, we go to the letter E, and E stands for our favorite law as it goes to employee benefits. And that favorite law is ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And it's also pretty old. It first came around in 1974, so it had its 40th birthday 2 years ago. And ERISA is the federal law that really governs the entire field of employee benefits. We have a really quirky exception in there, and the exception is except if there is a state insurance law that can govern employee benefits. But ERISA is applicable to any plan, fund, or program which an employer may establish or maintain, and it's really to provide benefits to employees and their beneficiaries. And ERISA even outlines what certain benefits that it governs, and it's generally when it provides for medical care, assistance, or sometimes unemployment, disability, and life. ERISA applies only to private employers. So if you're a governmental employer or research plan on the call, ERISA is not subject to you. But I think the key thing you have to be concerned about is even ERISA has some provisions that may have been put in another law that applies to a governmental plan. So we're going to go ahead and try and make you aware of that also. And again, ERISA governs health and welfare plans and then retirement plans, your 403, your 401k. The main requirements under ERISA is that you have disclosure, reporting, and fiduciary responsibilities. Under your disclosure, well, what does disclosure mean? You're telling plan participants about their rights, their obligations, what it will take to get in the plan, how much it will cost, how we can terminate your benefit. So in order to do this communication or disclosure, there are certain things that an employer as a plan sponsor has to provide. And those items are a plan document, summary plan description, and also a summary of material modification. So how's that as part of the alphabet soup there, all those S's going on or whatever? Under ERISA, the reporting requirement is called a Form 5500 and a Summary Annual Report, known as a SAR. Now, generally, the Form 5500 is only applicable to an employer, again, a private employer, who has 100 participants on as of the first day of the plan year. So right now, if you have 50 employees, 10 employees, 75, you don't really have to worry about that Form 5500 because you fall under that small employer exemption. You have less than 100 participants. However, and it's very timely, the Department of Labor and the Internal Revenue Service just published proposed regulations, and this happened on, several days ago, July 11th, and they want to remove the small employer exemption from the 5500 reporting. And what that would mean is that every employer who has a health and welfare plan would have to go ahead and do a 5500 reporting. This is a huge issue and something that we at JRG will be following as to what the regulators are going to be doing with this issue. Our next letter of the alphabet is F, and for F it stands for Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. The FMLA, as it is more commonly and lovingly known, it really was a social act. And it was recognized back in Bill Clinton's, I was going to say reign, but it's really an actual administration, not a reign. But it was recognized that many employees who had family issues that they had to deal with, someone got sick or they got sick themselves, and they may have to take care of someone, that they would be off work, and when they were off work, they'd be losing their group health plan. So again, Congress enacted the Family Medical Leave to again shift some of the responsibility to employers to say, if these things happen, there needs to be continued health care for employees. So Family Medical Act, again, what it requires generally, it says covered employers must permit eligible employees to take, first of all, amounts of unpaid leave, and that leave would be job protected. Then we're going to see a couple bullets say that during that leave, an employer must maintain group health plan benefits for an employee. An employee can be out for up to 12 weeks for family medical leave. And it's generally, again, to care for oneself if they're sick or for one of their family members. We also know the family medical leave was amended back in 2009, I believe, and it now includes also leave for military reasons. You have a loved one who is going to be deployed and you want to take some time off to be with them. Or there may be some reason, some things that they have to take care of. They have to talk to attorneys. Maybe they want to set up a will because they're not going to happen. As to application, it applies to those private employers with 50 or more employees for each working day in 20 or more work weeks in the current or preceding calendar year. So when we see this language, current or preceding year, we have to be a little bit careful because we may look and say, oh geez, last year, just right under the wire, I had 48 employees. And then comes the current year, we may hire 2 or 3 more people. We have to watch for those 20 weeks because once we have 50 people for 20 weeks, we become subject to the FMLA. It does apply to public agencies regardless of the size of how many employees they have. And as we already noted, benefits have to be available when the employee returns from their FMLA, and you have to continue to provide for them during that FMLA. Under G, we have a really interesting law that I'm finding a lot of employers aren't aware of this law, and it's called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA. And actually, GINA has 2 titles that can affect you as an employer. And the first title is geared towards or governs your health insurance, and it's as to non-discrimination. First of all, again, applicable to all group health plans. You have 2 employees or 20,000 employees, you're subject to GINA. And what GINA does is it prevents a health plan from using genetic information when you're trying to figure out what the premiums are or contributions amount would be for their health plan. It also prohibits requesting or requiring an individual or family members to undergo genetic testing. And then you can't request or require genetic information for underwriting purposes. What I have been telling employers, when GINA came out several years ago, sometimes it's pretty hard when you're asking for information because someone may take something to the doctor and you get it back and there's family, medical history there, and you didn't ask for it, and you're like, oh no, now what do I do? There is a notice that you can provide on information saying, we're looking for medical information, but we do not want family medical history, and that if you provide it, it's going to be inadvertent. That language is really important because that protects you from having a violation against you. So, again, something that you should be aware of. Other reminder, GINA amended HIPAA, which Chuck is going to talk about in 1 minute. And how it amended HIPAA is it now says any genetic information is protected health information, again, protected under HIPAA. The second title under GINA is based on employment non-discrimination requirements to you as an employer. Now, this title of GINA is only applicable to employers who have 15 or more employees for 20 or more calendar weeks in the current or preceding calendar year. And basically what Title II does, it just prohibits an employer from using any type of genetic information in your employment decision-making, in your hiring, your firing, promoting, demoting, and any type of adverse action. So you want to be aware of that. I have seen more EEOC action as to GINA, only because this is where you got to be careful. It doesn't say you can't go to your employee and say, hi, how are you doing, or, geez, I heard one of your family members is sick and going through something. You just have to be careful that once you do obtain any type of information, that if you make any decision, employment decisions, that an employee may say, hey, you know, the employer knew this about me, and now I'm being fired. I think I'm going to go ahead and talk to the EOC. So again, it's a very quirky act that's out there. And so now we're going to go back to Chuck for the letter H.
Well, thank you, Francis. Yes, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, commonly known as HIPAA, is another major law that impacts all group plans regardless of size. There are several titles and sections, as you can see. The privacy and security rules. This law has created a term that we all know now and love, protected health information, or PHI. Group plans can't disclose it. Generally, if you're in a fully insured plan, it's insurance company's responsibility to comply. But if you're self-insured, and this includes flexible spending accounts and health reimbursement arrangements, the employer has to comply with these rules, and includes a notice of privacy practices that we see virtually every entity that deals with us, whether it be credit cards or others, get these privacy notices. We know how they're handling any information. Special enrollment rights is another important section. Again, applicable to all group health plans. It allows employees to come into coverage or make changes due to certain specific things. And again, it does come with the notice requirement. Continuing on with Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, there's also non-discrimination rules. And really, the key words here are health status. Group health plans cannot discriminate as far as premiums, eligibility, and benefits based on the health status factors. There are exceptions if an employer puts in a wellness program. And we've seen over the last decade an evolution of wellness plans with incentives. And there's been great discussion back and forth about how to keep these plans in compliance with HIPAA. And there are ways to provide incentives, but you need to be very careful in how you design these plans. And we, of course, can certainly help you with that and stay in compliance. Some other laws that start with H are the health savings accounts, for instance, and this is due to the increase in consumer-based plans called high deductible health plans. This was introduced to really provide triple tax favored accounts for individuals to be able to put away money for future use to reimburse themselves or to retain balances through their working life and help to fund JRG coverage as well. Of course, there are limitations on contributions. Every year the government announces those limits. Health reimbursement arrangements have been very popular, and really HRAs are a way for an employer to self-insure a portion of the risk. In most cases, a part of the deductible charged to employees. And it's important not to confuse this with other things referred to as health reimbursement arrangements that are also called employer payment plans, whereby an employee gets individual coverage, shows you the bill, and you give them and you pay for it. That is not legal. It hasn't been legal. I imagine there's still some marketing entities out there stressing you can still do it. The IRS, HHS, Department of Labor don't always agree on things, but when all three issue a notice at the same time saying it's against the law, I'm not an attorney, unlike Francis, but I think you can pretty much realize that they're illegal. And there was a period of time, I think until July 1st of last year, that they were not going to charge any penalties for people to get rid of them. So the long and the short of it is you just cannot have a plan that gives money to employees that's contingent on them buying individual coverage. And moving right along to I, again, the most natural choice for this is the Internal Revenue Code, because when it comes to benefits, this is probably the most important factor in the expansion of benefits since World War II. Generally speaking, if an employer pays for coverage without any of these provisions, an employee would be charged, would be taxable income to them. Anytime you give them income is income, as you see here. However, right now, employee benefits are not taxable to employees due to the exception in the code. Now there are some in Congress that have talked about eliminating or capping this exclusion to fill the deficit caused by the possible elimination of the Cadillac tax. Time will tell on that down the road, but and including in these exemptions, again, reimbursement accounts, group term life insurance up to $50,000 can be provided without any taxable event to the employee, and that amount has not changed since 1969, by the way, and these other qualified programs. And this is applicable to all employees regardless of size. For M, you can see we have shortened the alphabet for you. I'm sure there are cheers out there about that. But we go to the Medicare secondary payer rule. And again, the ADA and ADEA are the foundations for this. And notice again the magic number of 20. If you have less than 20 employees, Medicare is primary. If 20 or more, the employer plan is primary. And again, it's generally created so that to reduce the obligation of the government and put it with the employer, which is a trend I'm sure all of you have noticed consistently as long as you've been in business. And they're really going after employers where they suspect that people are being pushed to Medicare that should not be. So it's an important thing to know. Also under M, Medicare Part D, another huge change in the law in the last decade. As every employer knows, there's an annual notice given to plan participants. The idea behind that, of course, is to prevent employees who have a plan while they're an employee, a drug plan that's of equal value or greater value than what Part D would have provided to them if they're over 65. Prevents them from getting a bill when they actually do retire and adopt Part D. What a lot of employers don't know that we've discovered is that you also have to make a disclosure to CMS electronically within 60 days at the beginning of the plan year. Another M is the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. And basically it's saying that you need to treat these conditions like you treat all other conditions. And we're finding that when there are audits being conducted, and more are being conducted every day, this is one requirement that's being focused on for compliance. We go to N, non-discrimination requirements. And again, this really talks about you can't discriminate in favor of the highly compensated individuals. As to premiums, eligibility, and benefits. It applies to self-insured group health plans, including the FSAs and HRAs, group term life insurance, cafeteria plans. And the penalty for being not in compliance is that these highly compensated individuals lose the tax advantages that we just spoke about a couple slides ago. Now the ACA, one of the changes that law was to make, under ERISA, self-insured plans had their own non-discrimination requirements, but fully insured plans were exempt. Well, ACA took that exemption away. However, they have yet to come up with the regulations. So we're in a period of non-enforcement due to that, and there's no timetable yet as to when those will show up. And now I'd like to reintroduce Francis to carry us to the end here.
Well, thanks so much again, Chuck. And you know, we're talking about all these laws, and we mentioned at the beginning there's at least 12, and we're probably even going over more than 12. And you know, our regulators put these into effect, and they don't just put it into effect just for the fun of it. So naturally, so they want them to be enforceable, and they want you actually to be penalized if you don't pay attention to them and follow them. So our favorite P word is penalties, and that's what we're going to discuss now on this slide. And the key thing with penalties, it really, first of all, it's going to depend on what the violation is, and it's also going to depend on what law. Now, we know that under some of the things that we've discussed already, they impose an excise tax. An excise tax always means that the IRS would collect it. An excise tax of $100 per day per affected individual. So some of these federal laws with the excise tax, such as failure to provide notices required under group health plan mandates. If you're not giving out your COBRA notices, and just as a reminder, there are at least 6 COBRA notices that could be applicable to a qualified beneficiary. If you're not handing out your WICRA notice, and for those of you who don't know what WICRA is, don't feel bad, because there's a lot of us. It stands for Women's Health and Cancer Rights Act. We're going to talk about that towards the end. Also, your grandfather notice. If you're still a grandfathered plan, which I doubt there are many of you out there, you have to provide a notice. And if you're non-grandfathered, you also have to give a notice, and that's called a Patient Protection Rights Act notice. So again, if you're not doing these, you could be subject up to $100 per day per individual. Also, failure to meet certain ACA requirements. So if for some reason your plan isn't providing preventive services, or there's pre-existing conditions imposed, or you're not permitting for clinical trials, and again, generally the carrier will take care of that, but you want to make sure of it, $100 per day. Why I thought it's also interesting that I get to speak about penalties is because, again, this is just recent action by the Department of Labor, but they just published some rules, and I believe it was June 30th, actually, they came out, and they said that they are increasing penalties under ERISA. The last time there was an increase was, I believe, 15 years ago, and these increases are effective soon, as of August 1st. So remember that chipper notice we talked about that you're supposed to be giving annually? That is increased from $100 today, a day to $110 a day for a failure. The SBC, which we're going to discuss, if you're not providing that, you could be penalized $1,000 per occurrence. That's going up to $1,087. We just talked about GINA. So any kind of failure under GINA is going up to $110 per day. And then failure to file the Form 5500. Right now the penalty is $1,100 per day, increasing to $2,063. And I think, again, mentioning the new regulation that just came, or proposed regulation that just came out July 11th, that's why it's so important. You may be sitting there saying, I have 25 employees. If they make me file 5,500 and I don't do it, I have to pay $2,063 a day. That's pretty scary. So we want to really, again, follow that proposed regulation that's out there, and so we can keep you informed. I think also the key thing to note is we really should put in there, it's up to, because the agencies have the authority and have the right to say, maybe we won't charge you $2,063. We'll only charge you $2,000 or $500 per day. Also, I put a note here as Chuck was speaking. So as he mentioned, these employer payment plans where you will just go ahead and pay for an individual plan for an employee. We know that's no longer permissible, as Chuck, proficiently said. All 3 agencies have gone against this. So I want to go ahead and think about that. If you are continuing to providing individual policies, the penalty is $100 per day. That would be $36,500 a year. There is no health insurance program that would ever cost you $36,500 for one individual, at least to my knowledge right now. So let's go ahead and move, and our next one is QMSCOs. QMSCOs come under Q, Qualified Medical Child Support Orders. Basically what this is, it's a judgment or it's a decree where it basically says that you may have an employee who has a child and they're not providing coverage, and maybe they're just in a situation that they don't have either custody of that child or what other things that life occurs that, you know, that child is just maybe not in that employee's picture right now. But they do have to provide them health care coverage. So a court orders that coverage and a QMSCO, that order comes to the employer. What we want to remind you is that group health plans have to go ahead and honor QMSCOs. And as a group health plan, as a plan sponsor, you have to establish certain procedures for determining whether a QMSCO is good and it has to be honored. And then you have to give some notice to the employee about that. Again, this is applicable to all group health plans of private sector employers. I want to note also that for governmental employers, because of an act called the Public Health Service Act, which we didn't address under the letter P here, but also because of the Internal Revenue Code, that governmental employers and church plan employers also have to comply with QMSCOs. The key thing is, under ERISA, a QMSCO, your policies and procedures either have to be addressed in your SPD or you have to put a notice that those procedures are available. Again, must be in your SPD. So we hope that you're all getting those documents together. Let's talk a little bit about record keeping under the letter R. Again, all of these various laws that we've talked about, and there are a lot of HR laws that we haven't even mentioned. Probably medical leave is the only one we really talked about, ADA. But each law really imposes a different record-keeping requirement. Some laws say that you have to keep a record 1 year after the termination. Some say 3 years. Under OSHA, you basically have to keep those records forever and ever. So the key thing is, again, we mentioned different requirements based on different laws. You really should have a records retention policy. Something, I know if you're still doing paper, and I'm a paper person, and it can just add up so quickly. And the next thing you have a stack, then you have a box, and it's boxes and boxes of paperwork. So there may be a time that you say, I want to get rid of some of this stuff. You should have a records retention policy to know, yep, it's been over 5 years, I can get rid of this record, I won't have to worry about it. You also have to consider just general legal or business considerations. Of course, anytime that you're either in litigation over a matter or if you've been subpoenaed as to certain information, you cannot destroy any type of record relating to that action. Also, if you would get audited, we have really been stressing how the DOL is auditing all of the group health plans. They are going to be asking you for records. Under ERISA, you're required to keep any type of record that is associated with ERISA. Enrollment forms, anything EOBs if you would get those from an employer. They're required to be kept for a minimum of 8 years. And under ERISA as employee benefit plans, what has to be retained is really going to be varied. It's based on what type of plan you have, what type of benefit, if it's fully insured versus self-insured, what laws is it subject to? Is it subject to HIPAA? Are you subject to COBRA? How benefits are provided, number of participants. So there's a lot of different variables that you have to look at here before you just start shredding those documents. So next we want to go to the letter S. And the first thing we wanted to talk about is the summary of benefits and coverage, lovingly known as the SBC. Now, under the statute and actually under the regulation, the SBC started out as a 4-page explanation. And the regulators literally told us it's supposed to be in 12 font. I mean, you talk about really doing some governance there. And also, we also know it's not 4 pages long because they said, well, we didn't really mean 4 pages. We meant 4 pages double-sided, which is 8 pages. But this explanation, it talks about what the benefits are, what the coverage will provide. And then you also have to give definitions, terms, and even examples. And there has to be a glossary attached to it. So what's key about the SBC is that if you change any information that is in the SBC, before you make that change, you have to give a 60-day advance notice to participants. So you have to be careful. You can't just go ahead and make a change and without giving that notice. And again, that's only if the change is outside of your open enrollment or your renewal period. So you renew on December 1st, and you said we want to make changes to the plan. You don't have to give a 60-day advance notice because that's during your open enrollment period. Certain time frames when you have to provide these to participants. 30 days within a new enrollment, actually 7 days if someone comes and asks for it, 90 days if there's a special enrollment period. The key thing I wanted to note here is that there are going to be new revised SBCs available as of April 1st that must be used for your plan year that begins on or after April 1st, 2017. We received those final regulations just this past March. So some other S requirements in our alphabet soup that we've already mentioned: a summary plan description, summary material modifications. And moving on to U, as we almost end up the alphabet here, U is under the Uniform Service Employment and Reemployment Act, Reemployment Rights Act, known as USERRA. And basically what USERRA does, it establishes reemployment and benefit rights for employees who serve or have served in the uniformed services. So this covers someone who either may decide now to join the services and go into one of the arms of services, or who may be in the reserves or who recently served. So it is applicable to all public and private employers regardless of their size. Again, comes to, we say applicable, 2 employees or 20,000 employees. Some of the rights that are available under USERRA is that if an employee returns within 5 years, so they join the service and they come back to you within 5 years after leaving you, due to being in the service, they have a reemployment right in the same position. And also the right they have is if they would have been receiving any increases in pay that you've been giving other employees in similar situations, they have a right to that also. As to the group health plan, you generally have to continue their coverage if they will be gone for 30 days or less. So if somebody is in the reserves and they're going to be gone for 30 days, their coverage continues. But naturally, if someone comes and says, I'm gone for 4 years, you're not going to continue coverage for 4 years. But that employee will experience basically a continuation coverage right. You need to be careful because a USERRA right to continuation coverage is slightly different than COBRA. Under COBRA, someone can only get it for 18 months. Under USERRA, an individual can get coverage for 24 months. And under USERRA, only the employee has the right. Spouses and dependents do not have a right to continuation coverage. And then next we move to W. And W is that WICRA that we already mentioned, Women's Health and Cancer Rights Act. And what this requires is that a group health plan, if you provide medical and surgical benefits for mastectomy, you also have to provide for reconstructive surgery. Now, we have this limited exception here. So it doesn't apply to a group health plan if on the first day of the plan year you have fewer than 2 participants who are current employees. Now, so that means you're going to have 1 active employee, or you may have a retiree program. Remember, a retiree is not a current active employee. So a retiree plan is not subject to WICRA. We have notice requirements under here, and we actually have 2. You have to give a WICRA notice when an individual first becomes eligible, and then annually. So you should be including this packet of this enrollment in your enrollment package, in your annual enrollment package, this notice, and hopefully you're receiving these notices from JRG. Now we have another W here that, as I was reviewing this, I didn't add it, but it's workers' compensation. And we know that workers' compensation is a state statutory law that requires that if you have someone who is hurt or injured on the job or has some type of disease from the job, that they can be off and then they get paid a portion of their pay. There is a big misunderstanding as to health benefits with workers' compensation. Many employers think someone's out on workers' comp, I have to continue their health care. And that's again, really is a misunderstanding because under the Pennsylvania statute, no employer is required to continue health care coverage when an employee goes out on workers' comp. Now, I have a little bit of a caveat here and a warning. If you are an employer who's subject to family medical leave and an employee is out for a period of time under workers' comp, they'd also have a family medical leave right. So FMLA says, guess what, you have to continue coverage, even though workers' comp says you don't have to continue coverage. So you always have to be looking for this coordination of different laws. Now, if you're have under 50 employees, then again, you wouldn't be subject to continuing their coverage. But you also have to remember, so if the employee is out and isn't eligible because they're not meeting the working hours requirements, they would have a COBRA right because they have a reduction in hours. So you have to be sure to offer them COBRA in that situation. So again, I just wanted to add that as I was thinking about this morning. So we've come to actually the end of our alphabet soup for today, and we did condense it a little bit. I mean, as I was sitting here thinking about this and preparing it, Chuck and I discussing different laws, there are a plethora of laws, again, that affect employee benefits and employers, and a lot of them we didn't include. Again, we didn't talk about Public Health Service Act. We didn't talk about Title VII. We didn't talk about pregnancy discrimination. So hopefully we've at least...
we could extend the webinar for another 2 hours.
Yeah.
We could take a vote, but I don't think we will.
So at this time, we hope that you use this document, and you can use it on your desk just to look up general information. So at this time, we'll go ahead and see if we have any questions. We don't have anything coming through at this time, so I'll take the opportunity to remind you our next webinar is August 11th at 10 a.m. And this one we're going to be talking about small employers, those who have less than 50 full-time equivalents. We're going to talk about the quirks of the ACA and, again, just general compliance for the smaller employers.
Well, we certainly thank you for your time today. And as we mentioned, we'll be getting information to you within the next few days. And again, appreciate you spending some time with us this morning.
Thanks so much. Have a good day today.